In a racially divided society, Charles Walker, a black lawyer driven by justice, and Clara James, a white journalist with a mission for truth, forge an unexpected bond. What begins as a professional partnership to expose systemic injustice evolves into a love that defies societal boundaries. But their relationship faces relentless challenges from a world unwilling to accept them. Can their love overcome the weight of prejudice, or will the pressures of society tear them apart? This story of courage, love, and the invisible thread binds us all. Charles Walker stood in front of a crowded courtroom, his deep voice commanding everyone present's attention. His client, a single black mother unfairly evicted from her home, sat quietly behind him. This case wasn't just about her. It was about exposing the systemic racism that permeated the housing system. Charles was a force to be reckoned with. His arguments were sharp, his evidence irrefutable. But as he delivered his closing statement, his mind wasn't on winning accolades. It was on justice, plain and simple. Sitting quietly in the back row was Clara James, a journalist for the Metropolitan Times. She had come to cover the case, expecting the usual legal jargon and bureaucratic indifference. Instead, she found herself captivated by Charles's passion. His words weren't just facts, but a rallying cry for change. After the verdict ruled in favor of Charles's client, Clara approached him as he packed his briefcase. "Mr. Walker, I'm Clara James," she said, extending a hand. "Your work is remarkable. I'd love to interview you for an article." Charles looked at her with wary eyes. The media had misrepresented him before, and trust didn't come quickly. "Why?" he asked. "With you on. But sometimes I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. Writing about problems isn't the same as solving them." When he called to thank her, his voice carried something she hadn't expected. Gratitude tinged with admiration. "You didn't just tell my story," he said. "You told the truth." From that point, Clara began accompanying Charles on his cases, not just as a journalist, but as an ally. They worked together to uncover injustices, exposing corruption in housing, police, and education. Their work was not just about facts and figures, but about the lives they were changing and the hope they instilled in their community. Their partnership blossomed into friendship, strengthened by a shared mission to challenge a broken system. But as their bond deepened, so did the tension around them. Whispers began to spread, questioning their relationship. Charles's colleagues warned him about associating with Clara, while Clara's editor suggested she avoid getting too close to her subject. The weight of societal scrutiny was constant, threatening to overshadow their shared mission. Despite the warnings, they continued to work together, their connection growing stronger with each victory and each challenge. The interview began with Clara's professional demeanor and Charles's cautious replies. Sitting across from him in a small cafe near the courthouse, she asked probing questions about his motivation and the injustices he had witnessed. Charles answered with measured words, but as the conversation deepened, Clara saw a man fueled by an unrelenting desire for justice. "Systemic racism isn't just a statistic," Charles said, his voice low but firm. "It's lived every day by people like my clients. I became a lawyer because I couldn't stand watching my community suffer without anyone fighting for them." Clara's pen moved swiftly across her notebook. She admired his honesty, but his connection to the issues struck her. As they talked, she began sharing her perspective, revealing her frustrations with her work's limitations. "I became a journalist because I wanted to make a difference," Clara admitted, setting her pen down. "But sometimes I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. Writing about problems isn't the same as solving them." Charles leaned back, studying her. "The truth matters, Ms. James. Without people like you, the fight doesn't reach beyond the courtroom." Their mutual respect grew. A week later, Clara's article was published, vividly describing Charles's fight against systemic injustice. The piece garnered widespread attention, earning praise from advocates and criticism from those who preferred to ignore such issues. But what mattered most to Clara was Charles's reaction. When he called to thank her, His voice carried something she hadn't expected. Gratitude tinged with admiration. "You didn't just tell my story," he said. "You told the truth." From that point, Clara began accompanying Charles on his cases, not just as a journalist, but as an ally. They worked together to uncover injustices, exposing corruption in housing, policing, and education. Their partnership blossomed into friendship, strengthened by a shared mission to challenge a broken system. But as their bond deepened, so did the tension around them. Whispers began to spread, questioning their relationship. Charles's colleagues warned him about associating with Clara, while Clara's editor suggested she avoid getting too close to her subject. Despite the warnings, they continued to work together, their connection growing stronger with each victory and each challenge. Late one evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Charles and Clara found themselves walking through the city. The streets were quiet, the weight of the day's events hanging between them. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. "Tired of what?" Charles replied. "Fighting, pushing against a system that feels impossible to change." Charles stopped and looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Every day. But giving up isn't an option. If I don't fight, who will?" Clara nodded, her admiration for him growing with every word. His dedication to the fight against injustice was inspiring. It was a beacon of hope in a world that often felt dark and unyielding. Then she realized that it wasn't just his dedication that drew her to him, it was his heart. As they reached her apartment building, she hesitated at the door. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," she said softly. "You're not just part of it," Charles replied. "You're making it possible." Their eyes met, and momentarily, the weight of their professional boundaries dissolved. Clara felt her heart race as Charles took a small step closer. But before either of them could act, the sound of a passing car broke the moment, reminding them of the professional boundaries that kept their feelings in check. "Good night, Clara," Charles said, his voice tinged with something unspoken. "Good night, Charles," she replied, watching as he walked away. That night, neither of them could sleep. They knew their connection was more than professional, but admitted it felt like crossing an invisible line. As their partnership continued, the whispers grew louder. Charles' friends questioned why he spent so much time with a white journalist, and Clara's colleagues accused her of losing objectivity. "Do you think this is wise?" one of Charles' colleagues asked. "People are starting to talk." Charles' jaw tightened. "Let them. Clara's been nothing but dedicated to this fight." But the criticism didn't stop. Clara's editor confronted her directly, warning her about the optics of her relationship with Charles. "This isn't just about your work, Clara," he said. "It's about your reputation." For the first time, Clara began to doubt herself. Was she jeopardizing her career? And what about Charles? Was their partnership putting him at risk? One evening, after a particularly heated argument with her editor, Clara met Charles at their favorite cafe. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she confessed, her voice breaking. Charles reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You're stronger than this, Clara. Don't let them win." Their bond was undeniable, but the world's pressures were relentless. They knew their growing feelings for each other would only complicate things. Charles and Clara knew the risks, but their growing connection became impossible to ignore. Late nights working together became conversations about their lives, dreams, and fears. One evening, as they reviewed evidence for an upcoming case, Clara leaned back in her chair, exhausted but determined. "You're going to win this one, Charles. I can feel it." He smiled at her, his gratitude unmistakable. "Only because I have you in my corner." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Charles," she began, but he interrupted her. "Clara, we can't keep pretending this is just about work." Her heart raced as he stepped closer. "I know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But what happens if we stop pretending?" Charles hesitated for only a moment before closing the distance between them. "We find out." The kiss was tender, the culmination of months of unspoken feelings. It was also dangerous. They both knew that entering a relationship would invite scrutiny, not just from the world, but also from their communities. But in that moment, none of it mattered. News of their relationship spread quickly. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers weighed in, their opinions often harsh and unsolicited. Charles faced backlash from his community, accused of betraying his roots by dating a white woman. "How can you fight for us?" one critic demanded, "when you're with someone who can't understand our struggles?" Clara wasn't spared either. Her editor called her into his office, questioning her professionalism. "This isn't just about optics anymore, Clara," he said. "It's about credibility." The couple leaned on each other, but the strain was undeniable. Clara struggled with guilt, wondering if her presence made Charles's life harder. "Maybe this was a mistake," she said one night, her voice trembling. Charles took her hands in his. "Loving you isn't a mistake, Clara. Letting them tear us apart would be." Despite their resolve, the pressures continued to mount. Their work began to suffer, and for the first time, they questioned whether their love was worth the cost. One fateful night, as they walked through the neighborhood where Charles out, Charles and Clara found themselves in the middle of the chaos, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Charles!" Clara shouted as a bottle flew through the air, narrowly missing him. He grabbed her hand and pulled her to safety. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," she replied, her eyes wide with fear. "But this can't go on." The experience became a turning point. Together, they held a community forum, inviting people from all backgrounds to share their stories and seek common ground. The event was met with skepticism, but by the night's end, something extraordinary happened. People began to listen to each other. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Charles and Clara realized their unconventional love symbolized what could be achieved when people came together. "Our love isn't the problem," Charles said during his closing speech. "It's the proof that the invisible thread connecting us all is stronger than the forces trying to tear us apart." The couple's courage inspired others to challenge their biases, sparking a ripple effect beyond their community. As Charles and Clara stood hand in hand, watching the crowd disperse, they knew their journey was far from over. But for the first time, they felt hopeful. Together, they would continue fighting for justice, understanding, and a world where love could thrive, no matter the obstacles.